Pollux gritted his teeth, biting back a scream as a human soldier gripped his mangled blue arm. The human's other hand clamped over the gushing wound in Pollux's side. The human lifted the gravely injured Pollux over his shoulders, jostling his shattered bones, carrying him away from the smoking battlefield strewn with dead Mazarians. Pollux's 8 eyes blinked in disbelief. Why would a human risk his life to save an enemy soldier? Don't they know the Mazarians are their mortal foes? Keith Carter, a tough human special forces operative, had seen hundreds of battles, but the carnage on Xyloth was sickening, even for him. Amidst the blood, bodies, and rubble of the once thriving Mazarian colony, now decimated after the brutal Grolic assault, Keith spotted a young Mazarian soldier still clinging to life, chest heaving with labored breaths. The human-Mazarian war had spanned decades, their forces clashing viciously across the galaxy with devastating losses on both sides. Every instinct screamed at Keith to move on, leave the enemy to his fate. Instead, he chose to save him. As Keith hauled the badly wounded Mazarian to safety, the alien gaped at him in shock. All Mazarians were raised on horror stories of ruthless human soldiers, heartless monsters who slaughtered their kind without mercy. Yet here was this human, Pollux's sworn enemy, dragging his broken body out of a literal hellscape, putting his own life in jeopardy to rescue him. Keith brought Pollux to the temporary human base camp, insisting their medics treat the alien soldier immediately. The human soldiers erupted in outrage, tend to an enemy combatant while loyal human warriors lay dying. It was unthinkable. Keith stood his ground even as they spat curses and threats. During the emergency triage, Keith learned the truth. The Mazarians weren't the aggressors on Xyloth. They had been defending the planet from a Grolic invasion. With the Mazarian forces decimated, nothing could stop the Grolic from stripping Xyloth of its invaluable Xanium ore, a rare resource crucial to both human and Mazarian interests. Worse, Grolic conquest of Xyloth could spark an intergalactic war, with Earth directly in its destructive path. Keith made an impassioned plea to his commander. By saving this Mazarian and learning their side, they could gain intel to safeguard humanity and billions of lives across the galaxy. Unmoved but aware of the stakes, the commander agreed to treat the Mazarian, but under armed guard. Keith was assigned to watch the prisoner himself. Over the next tense days, as Pollux slowly healed, he and Keith began to talk, hesitantly sharing stories of their families, planets, cultures. Trust grew between them, a fragile bridge spanning the chasm of a centuries-long conflict. But the other human soldiers seethed with hostility, viewing the Mazarian as a threat. The clock was ticking. Grolic scouts probed the edges of the human perimeter, the bulk of their murderous forces not far behind. Keith saw only one path forward. The humans and Mazarians had to join against their common enemy, an alliance that could save Xyloth and stave off galaxy-wide war. Two battle-weary soldiers from warring civilizations, now thrust into an unlikely friendship that could change the course of the future. If they could convince their own kinds to fight together instead of against each other, if fear and hatred didn't rip them apart first. As the medics worked to stabilize Pollux, Keith rarely left the Mazarian's side, his presence a shield against the hostile glares and muttered threats from the human soldiers. In the quiet moments between treatments, Keith coaxed Pollux to share stories of his homeworld, his family, and the rich history of the Mazarian people. "We never wanted this war," Pollux rasped, his voice strained with pain and emotion. "Xyloth is our ancestral home, where our civilization first flourished. The Xanium ore is sacred to us, integral to our technology and way of life. When the Grolic came, we had no choice but to defend ourselves and our resources." Keith listened intently, piecing together a picture far different from the propaganda he'd been fed his entire military career. He knew he had to act on this information, and fast. Ignoring the disapproving scowls of his fellow soldiers, Keith marched into Colonel Mitchell's makeshift command center. The colonel looked up from a holographic map of the region, his brow furrowed. "Carter, I hope you have a damn good reason for barging in here." "Sir, I do," Keith said, standing at attention. I've been talking with the Mazarian Pollux. He shared information that changes everything. The Mazarians aren't our enemy, sir. They're victims, just like us. The Gralik are the real threat here. Colonel Mitchell leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. And you expect me to take the word of a single Mazarian soldier over decades of intelligence? I expect you to consider the possibility that our intelligence has been wrong, Keith countered, his tone resolute. If we don't set aside our differences and work with the Mazarians, the Gralik will overrun Xyloth. And once they control the Xanium supply, how long before they set their sights on Earth? The colonel was silent for a long moment, the weight of Keith's words hanging in the air. Finally, he sighed. I'll consider your proposal, Carter, but you better be right about this. Keith returned to the medical tent to find Pollux struggling to sit up, his wounds freshly bandaged. I need to speak with my people, the Mazarian said, his voice urgent. If there's a chance for an alliance, I must convince them to take it. Keith helped Pollux to his feet, supporting his weight as they made their way to a waiting transport. As they sped across the battle-scarred landscape, Keith could only hope that the Mazarian leader would be open to reason. General Jar cut an imposing figure, his dark blue skin crisscrossed with scars from a lifetime of combat. He eyed Keith with open suspicion, his gaze softening only slightly when it fell upon Pollux's battered form. You expect me to believe that the humans, our sworn enemies, now wish to join forces? Jar scoffed, his deep voice rumbling in the cramped command bunker. Pollux stepped forward, his posture straightening despite the pain that flickered across his features. General, I have seen firsthand the honor and bravery of this human. He saved my life, at great risk to his own. If he believes an alliance is our best hope, I trust him. Jar opened his mouth to respond, but his words were drowned out by the sudden wail of alarm klaxons. The bunker shook with the impact of nearby explosions, showering them with dust and debris. The Gralik have found the human camp, Keith shouted over the din. We need to get back now. Pollux turned to Jar, his expression fierce. General, the time for deliberation is over. We must act, or all will be lost. Jar hesitated, the decades of conflict warring with the undeniable reality of their situation. At last he gave a curt nod. Go, fight alongside the humans. Show them the true strength and spirit of the Mazarian people. Keith and Pollux raced back to the transport, the sounds of battle growing louder with each passing second. As they sped towards the besieged human camp, Pollux shared what he knew of the Gralik's tactics and weaknesses. They arrived to find the base in chaos, human soldiers struggling to hold back the onslaught of Gralik warriors. Keith leapt from the transport, his rifle already firing, while Pollux limped towards the nearest group of defenders, shouting instructions on how to counter the enemy's moves. In the heart of the battle, Keith spotted a group of human soldiers pinned down by a Gralik ambush. He sprinted towards them, laying down covering fire as he went. With a final burst from his rifle, he took out the last of the attackers, pulling his fellow soldiers to safety. Across the battlefield, Pollux saw Colonel Mitchell engaged in hand-to-hand combat with a massive Gralik warrior. The alien had the upper hand, its bladed weapon poised to strike a killing blow. Pollux leapt forward, ignoring the searing pain of his injuries, and tackled the Gralik to the ground. They grappled in the dirt, Pollux's strength waning, until a shot rang out, and the Gralik went still. Colonel Mitchell stood over them, his sidearm smoking. He offered Pollux a hand, helping the Mazarian to his feet. I guess Carter was right about you, the colonel said, a hint of a smile on his grizzled face. As the last of the Gralik attackers fell, a cheer went up from the human soldiers. Colonel Mitchell turned to Keith and Pollux, his expression serious. This is just the beginning, he said. If we're going to win this thing, we need to take the fight to the Gralik, and we'll need the Mazarians by our side. Keith glanced at Pollux, a newfound respect and understanding passing between them. General Jar has agreed to an alliance. We'll need to coordinate our forces, come up with a plan of attack. Colonel Mitchell nodded. Then let's get to work. We've got a planet to save and a war to win. As the human and Mazarian leaders began to strategize, Keith and Pollux found themselves at the center of the planning. Their unique bond and knowledge of both sides made them invaluable assets in the coming fight. But even as they worked towards a common goal, tensions simmered just below the surface. Not everyone was happy about the alliance, and there were whispers of discontent from both human and Mazarian soldiers. Late one night, as Keith and Pollux pored over intelligence reports, a shadowy figure slipped into their tent. Keith reacted on instinct, pinning the intruder to the ground, only to find himself staring into the face of a human soldier. "You're making a mistake, Carter," the soldier hissed. "The Mazarians can't be trusted. They'll betray us the first chance they get." Keith hauled the man to his feet, his eyes narrowing. "And who are you to make that call? We're all on the same side now." The soldier spat at Keith's feet. "You've gone soft, letting that blue-skinned freak get in your head. You'll regret this. Mark my words." As the man stalked off into the night, Pollux let out a heavy sigh. "He's not the only one who feels that way. I've heard similar sentiments from my own people. This alliance is fragile, Keith. It won't take much to shatter it." Keith ran a hand through his hair, frustration etched on his face. "Then we'll just have to work harder to keep it together. Too much is at stake to let old prejudices tear us apart." In the days that followed, Keith and Pollux found themselves spending more and more time together, not just strategizing, but sharing stories of their pasts. Pollux spoke of growing up on Xyloth, of the ancient traditions and sacred sites now threatened by the Graulik. Keith, in turn, shared his own history, of the events that had led him to join the military and the losses he'd suffered along the way. Through these conversations, they began to understand the root of the conflict between their peoples, the misunderstandings and grievances that had fueled decades of war. And with that understanding came a glimmer of hope, a chance for a future beyond the bloodshed. But first, they had a battle to win. The Greylick forces were gathering, preparing for a final assault on the Xanium mines. If they succeeded, it would mean the end of both human and Mazarian presence on Xyloth, and a crushing blow to their collective future. Keith and Pollux stood side by side at the head of the assembled human and Mazarian troops, their faces set with iron will. They knew the odds were against them, knew that many of those standing with them now might not survive the coming fight. But they also knew that they had no choice. The fate of Xyloth, of their peoples, and perhaps the entire galaxy, rested on their shoulders. And as they looked out over the sea of faces, human and Mazarian alike, they saw not enemies, but allies, united by a common cause and a shared destiny. The final battle was about to begin, and Keith and Pollux were ready to face it together. The dusty plains of Xyloth erupted in chaos as the joint human-Mazarian forces launched their assault on the enemy stronghold. Keith Carter crouched behind a rocky outcropping, his pulse rifle clutched tightly against his chest. He glanced at the Mazarian soldier next to him, still marveling at the sight of their former enemies now fighting alongside them. "All units, move out!" Keith barked into his comm. He vaulted over the rocks, leading the charge across the open ground. Plasma bolts sizzled through the air, kicking up plumes of dirt where they struck. The acrid smell of ozone filled Keith's nostrils as he ran, zigzagging to avoid enemy fire. High above, Pollux's voice crackled over the comm. "Air support inbound, targeting their outer defenses now." Keith watched as Mazarian fighters screamed overhead, their energy weapons lighting up the sky. Explosions blossomed along the enemy's perimeter, but the return fire was intense. A Mazarian fighter spiraled out of control, trailing smoke as it plummeted to the ground. "Push forward!" Keith yelled, urging his troops on. They had nearly reached the first line of enemy fortifications when a hail of plasma fire pinned them down. Keith dove for cover behind the smoking wreckage of a transport, his heart pounding. "We're pinned!" he shouted into his comm. "That bunker's tearing us apart!" "I see it," Pollux replied. "Calling in a precision strike now." Seconds later, a Mazarian bomber swooped low over the battlefield. It released a payload that streaked towards the enemy bunker. The resulting explosion sent shockwaves across the ground, and Keith felt the heat of it even from his position. With the path cleared, Keith led his squad towards the heart of the enemy base. They rounded a corner and came face to face with a towering war mech, its weapons already tracking their position. "Scatter!" Keith yelled. His soldiers dove for cover as the mech opened fire, its massive cannons tearing chunks out of the ground. A familiar whine filled the air as Pollux' fighters strafed the mech, drawing its attention. Keith seized the opportunity, sprinting towards the mechanical monstrosity. He leapt, grabbing onto one of its leg joints, and began to climb. The mech lurched, trying to shake him off. Keith gritted his teeth, pulling himself up hand over hand. He reached the access panel on its back and yanked it open, revealing a tangle of wires and circuitry. With trembling hands, Keith planted the explosives deep within the mech's systems. He jumped clear just as the charges detonated, the force of the blast sending him tumbling across the ground. As Keith struggled to his feet, he saw General Jar leading a group of Mazarian warriors into the enemy command center. The sounds of battle grew more distant as the invaders' defenses crumbled. But their victory was short-lived. An alarm blared across the battlefield, its shrill tone sending a chill down Keith's spine. "They've activated some kind of weapon." Pollux's frantic voice came over the comm. "It's going to destroy the entire planet." Keith's blood ran cold. "Where?" he demanded. "Central Complex. You need to hurry." Keith sprinted towards the indicated building, Pollux joining him on foot. They raced through winding corridors, following the increasing hum of energy. They burst into a massive chamber dominated by a pulsing device. Its core glowed with an otherworldly light, growing brighter by the second. "We need to shut it down!" Keith shouted over the deafening hum. Pollux nodded, his fingers flying over a nearby console. "I can't breach their encryption." Keith studied the device, noticing a pattern in its energy fluctuations. "There," he pointed. "If we time it right, we can overload the core." Working in perfect sync, Keith and Pollux manipulated the device's controls. The hum grew to a fever pitch, the light almost blinding. With a final push of a button, the device's energy collapsed in on itself. The hum died away, leaving them in sudden, deafening silence. Keith sagged against the console, exhausted but relieved. Pollux clapped him on the shoulder, a weary smile on his face. As they emerged from the complex, they saw General Jar and Colonel Mitchell shaking hands, formally sealing their newfound alliance. Cheers erupted from the assembled troops, human and Mazarian alike. But not everyone shared in the celebration. In the shadows of a damaged building, a small group of soldiers from both sides huddled together, their faces twisted with anger and resentment. "This alliance is an abomination," a human soldier hissed. A Mazarian nodded in agreement. "We must put an end to it before it's too late." As the sounds of celebration filled the air, the dissenters began to plot, their whispered words carrying the seeds of a new conflict that threatened to undo everything Keith and Pollux had fought so hard to achieve. The victory celebration lasted barely a day before trouble struck. Keith and Pollux sat in the command tent, reviewing reports of supply convoys mysteriously vanishing and communication relays going dark across Xyloth. "This isn't random," Keith said, frowning at the datapad. "These attacks are too coordinated." Pollux nodded grimly. "Agreed. Someone's trying to cut us off, isolate our forces." Before they could discuss further, an aide burst into the tent. "Sirs, General Jar and Colonel Mitchell are missing." Keith's blood ran cold. "What? When?" "They were last seen entering a meeting to discuss alliance terms. No one's heard from them since." Keith and Pollux exchanged a look. This was no coincidence. They quickly assembled a search team, scouring the base for clues. In Mitchell's quarters, Keith found a crumpled note hidden under the bed. The handwriting was messy, but legible. "Briggs and Vicar, Wasteland Outpost." "Pollux, look at this," Keith called. The Mazarian's eyes widened as he read. "Briggs, I know that name. A human colonel, vocal opponent of the Alliance. And Vicar? A Mazarian extremist. Both of them disappeared weeks ago. They wasted no time mobilizing a strike force. As their transport sped across Xyloth's barren landscape, Keith briefed the team. "We're dealing with traitors from both sides," he explained. "They've taken our leaders, and we're going in to get them back." The outpost loomed ahead, a fortress of steel and stone jutting from the wasteland. Keith signaled for the team to move in quietly. They made it halfway to the entrance before alarms blared. Plasma bolts sizzled through the air, forcing them to take cover behind rocky outcroppings. "So much for stealth," Pollux muttered, returning fire. Keith shouted orders, directing suppressing fire as they advanced. The air filled with the acrid smell of ozone and burning metal as they fought their way inside. Room by room, they cleared the outpost. Bodies of human and Mazarian extremists littered the halls. Finally, they reached the detention block. "There!" Pollux pointed to a heavily guarded cell. Keith nodded. "On three, 1, 2. They burst around the corner, weapons blazing. The guards fell in seconds. As Keith reached for the cell controls, a deafening boom shook the building. A blinding light flooded the corridor. When Keith's vision cleared, he found himself face down on the floor, unable to move. Beside him, Pollux lay motionless. Boots approached. A gruff voice spoke. "Well, well. Looks like our prototype works perfectly." Rough hands dragged Keith to his feet. His muscles refused to respond as he was thrown into the cell alongside Pollux, Jar, and Mitchell. Two figures entered, one human, one Mazarian, Briggs and Vicar. "You're too late," Briggs sneered. "Your precious alliance dies today." Vicar nodded. "We'll execute you all and pin the blame on each other's forces. The war will reignite as it should." Keith struggled to speak, his jaw barely moving. "Why?" "Because this alliance is an abomination," Briggs spat. "Humans and Mazarians were never meant to be friends." "You'll destroy everything we've worked for," Mitchell managed to say. Vicar laughed coldly. "That's the idea." As the cell door slammed shut, Keith's mind raced. They had to find a way out, had to stop this madness before it was too late. But with their bodies paralyzed and time running out, hope seemed. Keith's muscles screamed in protest as he strained against the paralysis. Sweat beaded on his forehead, every twitch an agonizing battle. Beside him, Pollux's eyes darted frantically, searching for any weakness in their prison. "We can't let them win," Keith grunted through clenched teeth. Pollux's antennae twitched. "The cell. There's a flaw in the energy field." Keith followed Pollux's gaze to a barely perceptible flicker in the shimmering barrier. With excruciating effort, he inched his hand toward the anomaly. Pain lanced through his arm as he pushed against the field, but he felt it give way. "Now!" Keith gasped. In a burst of movement, they hurled themselves through the weakened section. Alarms blared as they tumbled into the corridor. Two guards rounded the corner, eyes widening in shock. Keith lunged, tackling the first, while Pollux disarmed the second with a swift kick. "We need to split up," Pollux said, tossing Keith a confiscated weapon. "I'll get Jar and Mitchell to the hangar. You draw their fire." Keith nodded grimly. "Good luck, my friend." They clasped hands briefly before darting in opposite directions. Keith sprinted down twisting corridors, the pounding of boots echoing behind him. Plasma bolts sizzled past his head, leaving scorch marks on the walls. He skidded around a corner, finding himself face to face with a squad of Briggs troops. Without hesitation, Keith opened fire, diving for cover as return shots filled the air. The acrid smell of ozone burned his nostrils as he rolled to his feet, taking down two more soldiers. Suddenly, the corridor dead-ended. Keith spun, heart racing as Briggs's forces closed in. He raised his weapon, prepared to go down fighting. A deafening roar filled the air as the wall beside him exploded inward. Through the smoke and debris, Keith saw Pollux at the controls of a stolen fighter, its weapons still glowing from the barrage. "Need a lift?" Pollux called over the comms. Keith grinned, leaping for the fighter's open hatch. As he clambered inside, a massive explosion rocked the outpost. Keith watched in horror as the hangar collapsed, burying Pollux and the ship under an avalanche of twisted metal and stone. "No!" Keith screamed, scrambling toward the rubble. "Pollux!" Consumed by grief and rage, Keith stalked through the crumbling outpost. He found Briggs and Vicar in the command center, frantically trying to salvage their plan. "It's over," Keith snarled, raising his weapon. Briggs sneered, drawing a wicked-looking knife. "Not yet, it isn't." They clashed in a brutal frenzy of fists and blades. Keith fought with raw fury, every blow fueled by the loss of his friend. Briggs slashed and jabbed, his eyes gleaming with fanatical hatred. As Keith staggered back from a vicious kick, Briggs lunged for the killing blow. Suddenly, Vicar appeared between them, taking the full force of the attack. Keith watched in shock as the Mazarian crumpled to the ground. "Why?" Keith gasped. Vicar coughed, blood staining his lips. "Because you showed me a better way." With a roar of outrage, Briggs charged. Keith sidestepped, using the extremist's momentum to slam him into the wall. A swift strike to the temple, and Briggs slumped unconscious. Heart-pounding, Keith raced back to the hangar. He clawed at the rubble, ignoring the cuts and bruises forming on his hands. Finally, he uncovered Pollux's battered form. "Keith," Pollux wheezed, his eyes unfocused. "Did we succeed?" Keith clasped his friend's hand. "We did. The alliance will hold." Pollux managed a weak smile. "Good. Promise me, you'll see it through. Our peoples need this." "I promise," Keith choked out, fighting back tears. Pollux's grip loosened, his eyes closing for the final time. Keith bowed his head, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Days later, Keith stood before a simple stone marker. The setting sun painted Xyloth's sky in hues of orange and purple. He placed a hand on the cool surface, remembering the friend who had changed everything. "I won't let your sacrifice be in vain," Keith vowed softly. "We'll build the future you dreamed of, Pollux. I swear it." As darkness fell, Keith turned away from the memorial. There was work to be done, a hard-won peace to nurture, and he would face it all with the memory of his Mazarian brother driving him forward.
You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.